Hi, I'm Ryan Schultz from The Ohio State University. In this lecture, I'll be examining the conflict and interaction of traditional Eastern medicine with newly arrived ideas of Western medicine in China and Japan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Let me begin with a brief introduction to the history, concept, and practice of traditional medicine in ancient China. Once we have that basic understanding in place, we'll be ready to examine the interactions of Eastern and Western medical practices in China and Japan. The origins of Chinese medicine are bound up with the philosophical doctrines of Confucianism and Taoism. Though radically different in some ways, the metaphysical concepts of these two worldviews would eventually both share a common adherence to the idea of yin-yang duality. Yin and yang were understood as the fundamental forces of the universe, and they were devised by Chinese thinkers around 600 BCE. These two forces, in different balances, could cause diseases by influencing the qi, or vital force, of the human body. A later system further refined the yin-yang concept by adding what was known as the five-element theory. This idea supposes that everything in the universe, including the body of man, is governed by the five natural elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Each of these elements has a season and a set of organs associated with it, and an imbalance in one element could cause problems with the others. Chinese medicine continued to refine its ideas over time, but the basic forms of treatment and medication remained consistent up until the first contact with the West. Though countless separate traditions of medicine rose and fell across Chinese history, the existence of common texts and the presence of a shared theoretical basis, as we've just outlined, both helped to preserve an overall paradigm that kept each physician identifiable as a practitioner of a truly Chinese form of medicine. The incredible longevity of these traditions can also be explained, at least in part, by another factor: the social, political, and cultural continuity of China itself. China had remained at least relatively stable over the 2,000-year history of the imperial regime. As a result, neither dynastic change nor the arrival of foreign doctrines in the 18th century were unusual, and neither, therefore, were able to seriously challenge the preeminence of Chinese medicine. It would not be until the 1910s and 20s that serious opposition to these ancient practices emerged on the national stage. Historians have offered three major reasons for this break. First, China underwent a period of extreme political change in the early 20th century, beginning with the 1911 revolution that ended the imperial system and ushered in a brutal period of internal disorganization and infighting. During this, respect for tradition was at an all-time low. New ideas were being tested in a desperate attempt to restore China's sovereignty and national integrity. This environment provided fertile ground for Western medicine to take root and grow. Second, the challenge posed by the arrival of Western medicine and its practitioners in China weakened Chinese medicine in the marketplace of ideas. Even the last emperor of China had been seen by Western doctors, after all. Traditional practices were steadily becoming associated with the kind of weakness and backwardness that had led to China's dominance and exploitation by European powers in the first place. Meanwhile, foreign medicine was increasingly viewed as powerful and modern. Finally, Chinese medicine was struggling as a discipline to adapt to the undeniable changes that were taking place in medical knowledge. While Western medicine was able to quickly adopt the technological advances of the 19th and 20th centuries, and so leverage new scientific discoveries in biology, chemistry, and physics, ideas like germ theory, for example, in the face of those, Chinese medicine struggled to even move past its ancient terminology. Its theories were complex, metaphysical, and esoteric. Its debates were more often intellectual and conceptual than they were scientific and concrete. This led to the denigration of Chinese practices, especially by foreign observers and government advisors. In their minds, Chinese medicine was no more than a form of sorcery, a deceptive practice based on pre-scientific knowledge that seemed more mystic than pragmatic. But even these tremendous challenges had only a very limited impact on the day-to-day reality of medicine in China during the first half of the 20th century. During that period, most Chinese still relied on it for their healthcare. Although Western medicine had first arrived with Christian missionaries in the mid-1800s, its practitioners had long struggled to win over patients who were far more familiar with the kinds of medicine that had been trusted by their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents. On top of that, there were relatively few doctors trained in Western medicine that were available to accept patients in any case. From 1886 to 1929, China saw just 24 private and public medical schools opened in total, producing only 3,816 graduates trained in Western medical science. Most of these graduates worked exclusively in urban areas, yet even as late as 1935, a survey of the city of Shanghai found that while already 1,182 college-trained modern doctors had opened new offices there, they were still considerably outnumbered by the 5,477 licensed native physicians practicing in the city. But this numerical advantage was not enough to protect Chinese doctors from intellectual assault in the public sphere. Reform-minded officials, seeking to discover how the West had risen so quickly relative to China, argued that medicine was one key to the strength of these foreign nations. Men like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, some of the most famous leaders of China's self-strengthening movement, deplored the poor state of public health in China's cities and fields, and criticized the failings of traditional medical practitioners. However, they did not suggest a wholesale rejection of the old ways. Instead, they encouraged scholars of Chinese medicine to develop their discipline through incorporating the results of scientific research, suggesting that they take what could be learned from the West and combine it with the traditions of the East. This line of thought prompted a positive response in the late imperial period. For example, in 1908, a group of Shanghai gentry sponsored a private hospital where Western and native medicine were to be applied in tandem. But after the 1911 revolution, the total legitimacy of Chinese medicine came into question. When Wang Daxie became the new Minister of Education for the Chinese Republic in 1913, he proposed the complete abolition of native medical practices and their removal from the educational curriculum. Though no such policy was adopted, the possibility that it might be caused unrest among traditional practitioners. They soon banded together to lobby the government for official representation of their work as a key part of preserving what they called the national essence. Practitioners of modern medicine, of Western medicine, counter-rallied. They denounced their native rivals' work as scientifically groundless, as ignorant of academic development, and contrary to the world's trend. One prominent critic, a man named Yu Yunxue, testified to Republican government committees that the theoretical basis of native medicine was fiction and its methods of diagnosis self-deception. He claimed that so long as the old medicine is not abolished, the people's thinking will not change, the cause of new medicine cannot advance, and the administration of healthcare cannot develop. He proposed a gradual outlawing of the practice of Chinese medicine, and to the shock of his opponents, these arguments were largely accepted by the Central Health Committee of the nationalist government in 1930. Native practitioners fought back. They mustered a defense on the grounds that their work was an important part of the Chinese tradition, that it encapsulated the Chinese national essence, and that Chinese medicine was uniquely suited to healing Chinese bodies in a way that Western medicine could never be. They saw any outlawing of Chinese medicine as an imposition of Western influence upon national identity, an infringement no better than the unequal treaties of the 19th century. With these arguments, traditional physicians succeeded in igniting a firestorm of resistance to the Central Health Committee proposal to phase out their practice by decree. Proponents of Western medicine were soon forced to back down. They explained that they did not intend to prohibit traditional doctors from practicing. They clarified that while they disapproved of native medicine, they did not mind native drugs, which were cheaper than patent medicine purchased from abroad. However, they did feel that even Chinese cures would be better applied through Western practices. They also resisted smears launched by the native physicians that accused Western doctors of having a lobbying effort mainly driven by hopes of eliminating their business competition. But none of it was enough. The tide of public support remained against Western medicine, and Yu Yunshue's proposal was never accepted. Although traditional Chinese medicine continued to face resistance and criticism thereafter, it would soon reverse the political losses that it had suffered by leveraging rising Chinese patriotic sentiment. In 1931, for example, a day of national medicine was declared, as the government-sponsored Institute of National Medicine was opened in the city of Nanjing. This institute was dedicated to traditional practices and had been sponsored by high-ranking Nationalist Party members in order to promote Chinese culture. Licensing requirements were also soon relaxed for native physicians beginning in 1936, and in 1937 a serious proposal was put forward to integrate Chinese medicine into the basic educational curriculum and to ensure equal representation of Western and Chinese medical practitioners on public health commissions. Both of these proposals were adopted, but the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 meant that neither was ever put into practice. After World War II, the Chinese Communist Party entered into an uncertain relationship with traditional medicine. Selective aspects of native practice, particularly those strongly associated with Chinese national identity and seen as compatible with socialist ideals, would be preserved and encouraged by the state, while other elements, especially anything seen as superstitious or anti-scientific, such elements were targeted for censure and elimination under the communist regime. So-called barefoot doctors, trained by the party, soon brought Western healthcare to rural areas for the first time, but they integrated it with traditional practices familiar to Chinese peasants. In the process, the elaborate cosmologies and complex abstractions of old Chinese medicine were largely erased and forgotten. Only its practices, cures, and therapeutic arts remained. Through this process, Chinese medicine was reborn in a new form, one that continues to coexist alongside Western medicine in China today. Let's now turn our attention to the history of traditional medicine in Japan, before looking at the rather different trajectory of Western medicine's introduction there. Most ancient medicine in Japan was essentially derivative of the Chinese model. Continental practices had made their way to Japan carried by Buddhist monks as early as the 5th century AD. However, Japan had also developed an indigenous medical tradition, derivative from the Shinto religion, well before this time, one based less on the 5 Chinese elements and more on Japanese conceptualizations of spiritual purity, pollution, and cleansing. This native tradition briefly clashed with the new foreign ideas of Chinese medicine, but the widespread acceptance of Buddhism and other foreign cultural aspects by the elite class in the Nara period, beginning in 710, ensured Chinese medicine's steady adoption. By the Tokugawa period, almost 900 years later, Japanese variations on Chinese ideas had led to the rise of a wide variety of derivative medical traditions. One of the largest, called Goseiha, was deeply tied to Buddhism. It was intensely theoretical and esoteric in its theories, and its rival school, the Kokoha, opposed this. Kokoha physicians, by contrast, emphasized actual practice and first-hand observation. The most prominent work published by this school even rejects yin-yang theory, for example. These Kokoha physicians were among the first to express interest in Western medicine when it came to Tokugawa Japan in the late 1700s. Western medicine had arrived together with the Dutch traders who were then active in Nagasaki, Japan's sole port open to foreign trade. Under Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune, the study of European ideas brought to Japan through Dutch books was encouraged. So-called Dutch studies were seen as a tool to aid the country, and by the 18th century, foreign texts were being actively sought out as new sources of scholarly knowledge from abroad. Many of these works were medical in nature, and European doctors who came to Nagasaki, men like Engelbert Kampfer and Philipp Franz von Siebold, assisted eager Japanese scholars in interpreting these books and understanding their contents. A landmark event occurred in 1771, when Japanese physicians gained state approval to conduct a dissection of a human body. Comparing the reality of the body's inner workings with both their newly acquired Dutch diagrams and their traditional Chinese ones, the Japanese doctors found that the Chinese charts were grossly simplified and inaccurate. The publication of a book in Japanese on this experience triggered a crisis in the Tokugawa medical world. It was gradually recognized among leading Japanese physicians that Chinese medical theories were seemingly incompatible with the objective observation of reality. In 1824, on the cusp of the Meiji Restoration, physicians of this new Western learning school of medicine introduced the smallpox vaccine to Japan. And in the process, they dealt a tremendous blow to the prestige of the remaining practitioners of Chinese medicine in Japan, who could hardly claim to have a way to prevent such a deadly disease. As in China, these native practitioners banded together in an attempt to counter the rising tide of Western medicine. But the old-style doctors could not make the same claim to reflect the Japanese national essence as their continental counterparts could to reflecting Chinese essences. Indeed, in 1869, just 1 year after the collapse of the Tokugawa regime and the restoration of imperial rule, the new Japanese government officially adopted the German system of medical education as part of their modernization campaign. The changeover was slow. In 1873, there were about 23,000 doctors trained in the Chinese tradition and active in Japan. By comparison, there were only 520 registered Western-style physicians. But still, at the state level, the tide had clearly turned. In 1876, a law was passed mandating that all doctors had to study Western medicine, regardless of their practice. And in 1883, extremely rigorous regulations were put in place as part of the promotion of public health that greatly impacted the ability of traditional Chinese doctors to practice. Although traditional medicine was never outlawed in Japan, it declined rapidly after it lost the support of the government. The use of Western medicine and surgical techniques to treat soldiers wounded in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War also served as another publicly visible reminder of the government's belief in the superiority of Western techniques. Today, traditional Chinese therapies and curatives remain available in Japan, but they are promoted largely within the familiar framework of Western science and Western practice. Why, one might ask, was the Japanese adoption of Western-style medicine so much more rapid and seemingly painless in comparison to the Chinese experience? It's not an easy question to answer, but one possible explanation is simply that Westernization and European practices in general were not forced upon Japan as aggressively as they had been truly forced upon China. Rather, they were adopted willingly, and doing so was seen by the Japanese state as a way to strengthen the nation and its people, rather than as a foreign tool of oppression intended to weaken the government and confuse the population. The story of the interaction of Eastern and Western medicinal practices in China and Japan, then, is one that is best understood as just a single facet of the larger experiences of cultural exchange, imperialism, and conflict that characterize the global history of science, medicine, and technology in the 19th and 20th centuries.